Washington, D.C., the residents there, they have a larger population than 2 states. There are more, the average person in D.C. pays more federal taxes than all states. The total number of tax dollars altogether, more than 22 states, and D.C. has a gross domestic product bigger than 16 states. But what Washington, D.C. does not have is voting representation in Congress. In other words, they have no say in Congress on Supreme Court justices, taxes, spending, issues of war and peace. But there is an effort to try and change that. Joining us now is Bo Shuff. He is executive director of DC Vote. Bo, the House passed the DC Statehood bill. The Senate is taking it up and has scheduled a hearing. How significant is that?
It's massively significant. It's the second time in history that the House has passed this bill, the first time being all of a year ago. And for the Senate to take this bill up while it's passed one chamber is also historic. We've had hearings a couple of years ago, 7 years ago to be exact, but it was not while the bill was in play. So we're at a really serious stage and a very, very historic one.
A lot of people may be confused. Why is it that DC is not a state, or at least doesn't have that voting representation in Congress?
Sure, the Constitution requires a federal district that is home to the capital, so that it belongs to all Americans. And we agree with that. The DC Statehood bill would preserve that federal capital and a federal district. That federal district is always going to be under control of Congress and always going to be available to the American people. But the land where our schools and our neighborhoods and our families and our grocery stores are would become the 51st state, Douglas Commonwealth, that would allow the 700,000 of us that call DC home to have full and equal representation.
In other words, there's a federal enclave perhaps between the Capitol, the monuments, the White House, the Lincoln Memorial, and then the residential areas outside would be essentially the state. But there is this argument that some Republicans have made that, well, wait a second, we've already given electoral votes to people within this federal enclave. How can we change this without having to change the Constitution?
Well, sure, and there's a number of ways to deal with. The first one to keep in mind is that the 23rd Amendment has 2 parts to it. One that creates the electors, and the second part that allows Congress to figure out how to deal with those electors. And so Congress can do with it what they want to make sure that those electors either follow the will of the people and are awarded based on popular vote is one idea. Congress can also simply decide not to seat them or not to allow them to vote, because there has to be some mechanism. This was upheld in Bush v. Gore for electors to be chosen, ratified by a legislature, and then seated and cast their votes. And until Congress takes a preemptive action, that wouldn't happen. Additionally, we've seen challenging amendments, specifically the 18th, prohibition, repealed very quickly. The 21st Amendment that repealed prohibition happened in less than a year. And the 23rd doesn't come into play for another 3 years. There's plenty of time for it to be dealt with.
Washington, D.C., or at least the residents of D.C., they're the only ones in any democracy around the world that are not represented in essentially the federal government. That's the unique distinction in the United States. Washington, D.C. is comprised of about half of the residents are African Americans, 70% of all the residents are Democrats. Is that the toxic brew here, racism and politics?
Absolutely, Jerry Connolly, representative of Virginia, said it exactly that way. When they tell you it's not about race or politics, it's absolutely about race or politics. Look, the District of Columbia freed the slaves before any other federal location. Emancipation Day here is a district holiday, and it was before any other jurisdiction done by federal action. And that means there was a huge influx of an African American population. And the District of Columbia has always been Chocolate City. It is an African American majority for most of its existence, and now plurality. It would be the only state with a plurality African American jurisdiction, and just one of 4 where the persons of color are a majority. It is absolutely part of the reason why representation is denied here.
I'd hate to be the skunk at the garden party, but it seems like to get anything done in Washington, D.C., you have to agree to perhaps break the filibuster, and that requires the agreement of Senator Sinema and Senator Manchin from West Virginia, Sinema from Arizona. Where do they stand on DC statehood?
Yeah, let me challenge your phrasing just a little bit. We get a lot of stuff done here in Washington, D.C. It's Congress that doesn't seem to be able to get stuff done.
Fair point.
But you're on. We do not have an opinion out of Senator Sinema. That education work is ongoing. We're working in Arizona to make sure residents are aware of the situation and they can talk to their elected officials. Recently, Senator Manchin has said that he would prefer to see a constitutional amendment deal with statehood, and we've presented arguments as to why that isn't necessary, isn't required, and isn't how we've always admitted states. 37 of them, in fact, all of them except the original 13, came in based on basic, simple legislation requiring a simple majority. And never once has a statehood admission been filibustered. So I think that we're going to do some more education and convince those 2 senators and the 2 others from the Democratic caucus that aren't on the bill yet that statehood is in line with American values.
But you would agree there's not 60 votes in the US Senate for statehood right now, right?
Not yet.
Okay, now it's possible, I suppose, if you can get to 51, and the idea is you would carve out what's known as a filibuster exemption, the same thing that Republicans did in order to carve out a simple majority for Supreme Court justices. Is there anything necessarily wrong in your view with a filibuster exemption, carving it out just for granting statehood?
There isn't, especially because statehood is in a different part of the Constitution than is legislation. There is actually some precedent for the idea, maybe not precedent, but there's an argument to be made that statehood is a special thing. It's mentioned separately in the Constitution from passing bills or raising taxes. And so it should be treated in a different way. And like I said, 37 times there's never been a filibuster of a state, and it shouldn't be this time either.
One of the interesting arguments I've heard from a couple of Republicans, including Matt Gaetz, Republican from Florida, of all members of Congress, suggested that he's against statehood, but he would be in favor of rolling back federal taxes on DC residents. In other words, giving DC residents the same tax status as, say, the residents of Guam and Puerto Rico who also don't pay federal taxes. Would that be a solution?
The idea that Matt Gaetz is offering a serious solution to anything is a bit humorous on its front. But the fact of the matter is Washingtonians are proud to be Americans and we're proud to play our part. And we're fine passing and paying our taxes. We understand what that means. It means that we can, implement things like universal pre-K and other things that are important to Washingtonians. So we're fine paying our taxes and we'll continue to do so. We just feel like we fought a war over taxation without representation. We won, and it should apply to everybody.
How much of the conversation has changed, both because of President Trump and that photo op he had over a year and a half ago, where he went to a church across the street from the White House, used federal forces to essentially clear out peaceful protesters. And by the way, they did use tear gas. And then also because of January 6th, it wasn't as if DC could suddenly call up the National Guard. Only the president can call up the National Guard into DC.
Both of those instances were most definitely wake-up moments for some folks across the country. There's always been a key support level for statehood and for understanding what's going on. But absolutely, there were folks who didn't necessarily know what it meant to live in DC and what it meant to live without representation. And those moments were an opportunity for us to show them what that really felt like. And the fact that the president can take over our local cops without any notification.
Well, look, it's long been shocking to me, and I was a resident of DC for 17 years and fought like hell for DC statehood. So I'll be honest about this. I do think it's total racism and politics that DC is denied representation in Congress. There is this other idea that a couple of Republicans have floated through the years, and that is, okay, go ahead and grant a voting representation just in the House to DC, and then grant an extra vote to, say, a state like Utah.
Yeah.
Where does that go?
That idea it actually passed both chambers. It was in 2 separate Congresses, so it didn't become law. But it has passed and it had bipartisan support. The problem there is, even if you go so far as to give DC a vote in the House and 2 full votes in the Senate, you still have control of the district by Congress, and that's just not fair. We have absolutely no local autonomy. The Congress has the ability to overturn our local laws and our local spending. We're prevented all the time. We can't legalize marijuana, for example, even though residents voted massively in support of it and states across the country have implemented it. We have no ability to use Medicaid funds for low-income abortion services, even though other states can. They blocked domestic partner registries for 10 years. They blocked needle exchanges for 10 years. There's just myriad of examples of times that Congress has interfered with the decisions that DC residents have made about how to govern DC. And that is one of the most fundamental American values there is, that we are governed based on the consent of the governed.
And to people who are not aware of this, I mean, DC's budget is still essentially subject to the approval of Congress. So as you mentioned, 10 years ago, as I saw, when DC wanted to have a needle exchange program, well, the money for that was stripped out by Congress and said, no, DC can't do it, even though the residents of DC, the leadership of DC said, no, this will help us.
Yeah, and it goes to the ridiculous. 2 years ago, they told us we couldn't label wet wipes in a specific way because members of the House of Representatives objected to it. So we couldn't say that a wet wipe was flushable. So whether it's the ridiculous or the very serious, Congress interferes and we have no say in Congress.
Are you very optimistic about this, or is there reason to still be pessimistic given the political divide in Congress right now?
I am a hardworking optimistic is the way that I like to put it. We have the best shot we've had in a very long time We've advanced this bill farther than ever before in history, but we know that there's work to be done.
And to get it done, what gets it across the finish line in your estimation?
I think the biggest thing is we have to continue to increase support among the American people. We saw polling supporting statehood 4 years ago in the 30s, and we are now at 54. And so we're going to continue to work to teach people about what life in the district is really like, that we can go bowling, that we have a landfill, important things to become a state, as some of our opponents have pointed out. But that's the work we're going to do, and I think that's what's going to get us to the finish line, is getting that support among the public up higher.
Well, Bob, good luck to you. And again, the statistics to me speak for themselves. A larger population than 2 states, a larger gross domestic product than 16 states, more total federal tax dollars than 22 states, more active members of the military called DC home than 33 states. It is time for statehood for the District of Columbia in some fashion. Bob, good luck to you. And thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
You got it.
Thanks for watching the Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.